If you will recall, for the last number of Sundays, we were reading not from Mark's Gospel, but from the Gospel of John, known often as the Bread of Life discourse. So it might be important for us, I think, to recognize as we re-engage Mark after those weeks that before this is chapter 7, and before this, in chapter 6, we heard about the distribution and the breaking of the bread to the 5,000 in Mark's Gospel, and also Jesus walking on the water. And in that passage, it was known at the very end that they didn't understand about the loaves. And it was because of their hardness of their hearts, it said. And then there was another healing or a miracle where Jesus was heading into a Gentile territory. So then we arrive here, and we hear some folks, the Pharisees and some scribes from Jerusalem, gathering around Jesus. We hear what they said to him and how he responded to them. But one thing I think is important is that their criticism has to do with the way that at least some of the disciples were eating their meals. And if we look a little bit deeper, it could have been implying in the time of Mark, because he was writing a number of years later, that there was some divisions as those who gathered around the table of the Lord, eating the loaves. That some were doing it one way, some thought they had to go back to the tradition of the elders. So there was this division that was happening, they think, during the time when Mark was writing the gospel. So Jesus' words, Mark bringing them into this experience, was helping them to see that the Pharisees and scribes were not just this group from the past, but in some ways also might describe themselves, the disciples, and that's why they're so prevalent and remembered often in the Gospels, is because sometimes, more often maybe than we'd like, we may imitate or look like the Pharisees, who in this Gospel were recognizing an inconsistency in the life of the disciples of Jesus, and how I sense this hardness of heart that we heard about is being addressed. And we hear that prophecy from Isaiah, which indicates that somehow, even those who are seemingly being consistent, living with the commandments, might live only from what they're saying and not from their hearts. Their hearts are far from me, while their lips honor me. So I think this possibility in our own lives is at least bringing out an important teaching for all of us, and to be looking where and how we grow, because I sense that that's what Jesus is inviting them and us, is to a change of heart. And that's a change that's really a new creation. It's not just looking at what's there, because we can see that what's there often leads to those things that are at the end, all those vices that we heard about that somehow come from within. So we need what is sometimes referred to as the medicine, that's what the Eucharist is all about. Pope Francis reminds us that it's not an award for the successful, but medicine for the sick. So we're hearing about a sickness here, and sometimes we might get that and not recognize it in our own lives, but I sense that part of it is growing to learn how to continue to respond to the nourishment, the medicine that is the bread of life, and how it calls us to change and to cooperate with God's grace, and sometimes ask for help when we can't do it on our own. And I sense that that's the invitation from, as the second reminds us, is that God is changeless, but we are not. In fact, that's what we're invited to continue to grow more and more to, this conversion of heart, and that the Eucharist plays a central role in that transformation. It's not magic, but calls us to be nourished in some ways that continues not just to satisfy our hunger, but to make us hunger for more. And to see how that's called, and the second reading gives us this, to be doers of the word, not just those who know it even, or can even say it, but this is somehow coming not just because we're doing the right things and trying to get the reward, but because it's flowing now from our recreated hearts. And that's in communion with Jesus and one another. And we begin it here by our wishing one another peace, our praying the same prayers, often kneeling and standing at the same times as signs of unity. And then we're sent forth because it doesn't just end here. We know maybe that's part of our own growth, is that we thought, well, it's just a Sunday thing. I can do it there for an hour. But no, it's a lifetime thing where we then are called to take this nourishment and become it in some ways by living it out, even if it's just outside here, being gentle with one another in the parking lot or at our own workplace, in our families, in our homes. We take the nourishment, the medicine, so that we can then go there and not be perfect right away. Obviously, it's going to take some time, and it did for the disciples, and it still does for us. So it's more of a marathon than a sprint. But we have to trust that God is unchanging, and that's not just because he doesn't like to do different things. That's because he's always faithful. That's the changelessness of God, and he's calling us to do the same, to be faithful to him, at least attempting to do so in a way that's revealing this conversion of heart, which I think the first reading was saying is in some ways a sign of intelligence as well, that they were looked on as being smart because they had somehow figured out how to be in response to God's commandments. And that's, I sense, true, too, of us, that this is a wisdom now that we're invited to be embraced by, nourished, and sent forth by, so that we have now a calling to not just enjoy the meal, but to make sure that everybody knows that it's for them, that this nourishment, this medicine is there for all. And that's our task then, is to say, okay, how do I live a life that might lead people to ask that question? How do I get what they've got? How do I continue to grow and somehow be able to handle the challenges or the crisis or the sickness or whatever it might be that affects our lives in a way that's continuing to proclaim this message of Jesus, faithful to us, cost what it may?